Welcome back to Stormworks. I have made a more full-featured rocket. Full-featured in terms of rocketiness. It gets you into space with plenty of fuel left over. It doesn't do things like RCS or life support, but it does get you into space. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that first step very well yet, so I'm going to show it to you. The first thing you're going to notice is that I am using custom tanks. These are manually built fuel tanks. They don't just use the metal cans. Now the reason for that is pretty simple. These metal cans suck. They only have one intake, and that's no good. The downside of using your own manual tank is that you do have to pump it full of fuel. And you might think, oh, that sounds like a ton of extra work. Unfortunately, you'd have to pump the big metal cans full of fuel as well. Even at their default maximum value, these only contain 10% of their actual maximum capacity. So even if you're using these metal tanks, you're still going to want to pump them full of fuel, and if you're going to be pumping it full of fuel anyway, you might as well make it a custom tank, because that way you can have a bunch of intakes. I've got 8 intakes into my hydrogen and 4 intakes into my oxygen, and that means I can pump it full of fuel 8 times faster and 4 times faster than if I only had 1 intake. Now, the amount of fuel contained in these 2 repositories is pretty staggering. This is a lot of tanks, as you can see, and half of their full capacity has gone into these tiny little custom tanks. This entire column and this entire column, half of that is in this rocket now. And most of that is in these tanks here, and some of that is in the rocket itself, because the rocket engine itself has internal fuel tanks. When it comes to wiring the rocket engine up to the fuel tanks, a lot of people get worried, because the rocket engine has a hydrogen intake and it has an oxygen intake, and they're not really very amenable to getting hooked up to the tanks that you use if you're using the big metal tanks over there. But with a custom tank, it's pretty easy. Look, this is how I hook it up to the hydrogen fuel with an air filter. And then I run it up through the hydrogen tank into the oxygen tank and use an air filter there. It's super basic. There's no complicated piping, there's no valves, there's nothing going on here that is difficult for anybody. The only thing that's difficult is that I used ropes, and I did that, or hoses, and I did that just because I prefer the look of the hose sticky outy bits to the look of the hardpoint sticky outy bits. But obviously, if you're designing your own rocket, you can use a hardpoint system instead and not have to manually detach any hoses. That's up to you. Spin that away. Spin that away. Head on up here. Got a couple of things over here in case I need them, and I do. There we are. Now I am equipped for space travel. Do not try to go into space without a spacesuit. And then we'll just hop onto our space seat. Now over here we can see the throttle. It is set to 0.1. That's right. This entire thing is going to run at 10% of its actual capacity. I could use a small rocket engine on this. That's how little energy it takes to actually get into space. Normally, there's an enormous amount of overhead due to all of the extra tanks you're carrying. Like, the metal of the tank weighs a whole bunch. But in this, we've hyper-compressed all of our fuel down into a very small space, and our tanks are quite light. They're just voxel tanks. So we aren't going to have any difficulty getting into space. Now, I have 2 solid rocket boosters at the sides. They do a lot of heavy lifting to get us out of the soup, the lower atmosphere, and then they just go away. They detach and leave us on our own. We're running at 260 meters per second out of the soup, and in a second they'll go off on their own. And now we are just purely running liquid fuel, and you can see our speed has dropped. One thing about launching rockets that you're going to want to be aware of, space is not normal in this game. It's not you can't drift. There's drag everywhere you go, and the speed that the drag will take you to differs depending on where you are. Now you might think, oh well, that's atmosphere, but it's a little more complicated than that, because there's also drag around the moon, but only at a certain distance from the moon. And then when you get closer, the drag goes away. I think what happened is the dev kind of kludged together some stuff involving atmospheric pressure around just celestial bodies in general, and didn't realize anybody was going to be going fast enough to actually trigger any of it. But the end result is that you don't want to try and go too fast, because you're going to waste an enormous amount of fuel trying to get above the speed limit of wherever you are in space. In this case, we're up at nearly 400 meters a second, and we're exiting into the black any second here. I'm letting us go at a fairly high clip. 0.1 is actually quite a high throttle for here, just because I don't want you to wait around. But you can get up here with even more of your fuel intact. We've burned almost 25% of our fuel. We could have knocked that down to maybe 12% by just being a little more judicious. There's the moon over there. Obviously, we don't have a hard time steering. Just tap over and aim at the moon. We're running at 600 meters a second, and we're stable. And that's because of the speed limit here. We're actually pushing above the speed limit by a specific amount given our throttle, but there's no reason to do that. We might as well just hit space to turn off our ignition, and we'll simply drift along at whatever the speed limit is around here, which I think is like 450. And if we start to get a little bit, sus about hitting the speed limit, and maybe we're not thinking, we don't want to go this slow, we can always just hit space to turn the rocket back on, and then hit space to turn the rocket back off. Or, of course, we could lower the throttle. But the point here is that if you follow the speed limit, if you can find the sweet spots, you can get to the moon with almost no fuel, just like in reality, right? Except for instead of orbiting, we're just going straight there. Now, in this case, I'm not going to spend all of our time trying to reach the moon, because that would be a long video, and I'm sure that you don't want to just watch that happen. So we're going to throttle up. You can see that we're drifting a little bit. Oh, that drift was my fault. My bad. It's really touchy because we were putting out so much thrust, and there's so much resistance from the magical space atmosphere. Normally you would not run at this rate here. We've burned through a tremendous amount of fuel at this point, being as inefficient as possible. The point of this space exploration game is to teach you how to do efficiency, I think, because with the default tanks at the default pressure levels, you have to really try to get to the moon. Like, it's a challenge. And in this case, I had to really try to run us out of fuel on the way to the moon. There's just no possible way to run out of fuel on the way to the moon in this rocket if you actually do it correctly, because you will land on the moon with half of your fuel remaining if you follow the speed limit. Now, we are out of fuel in our tanks, and that was us running out of fuel in our rocket engine itself. And you can see that we're once again drifting back down to wherever that speed limit is, like 450 or whatever. Except for here, I think it's like 500. But that's the secret. That's the secret to traveling in space. Find the speed limit. Don't bother trying to burn yourself out going faster than it unless you found a glitch that I'm not aware of. Just let yourself cruise along. Occasionally punch in some extra, oomph to restore your speed, but otherwise just take your time and you'll get there with no fuel. With no fuel wasted. One thing to keep in mind is that when you don't have a rocket running, you can wander around in space. Your space exploration suit works fine. It has a rocket RCS system attached to it, so you can drive yourself around. But it remains oriented relative to the planet. So I can't tilt myself to be oriented relative to the rocket, and that can make it extremely difficult to actually go on spacewalks. So I do recommend that you have tethers all around so that you won't have to worry about detaching and flinging yourself off like that. So let's look a little bit at the mechanics of getting this to work at all. Just open it up in the editor here. So the first thing you'll notice is that I have a huge bank These on the bottom 4 rows are all hydrogen, and the top 2 rows are all oxygen, because you burn 2 hydrogen for every oxygen, so you want twice as much hydrogen. That's why the hydrogen tank is twice as large on the ship itself. And I'm using a parallel pump system because these have a maximum amount of liquid or fuel they can carry. So if I have 8 separate fuel lines, I can carry 8 times as much fuel. Now I'm powering these impellers with a glitch engine. You do not have to use a glitch engine. It works just as well with a giant bank of batteries and some heavy motors. It's the same thing. So, you know, you can do this without glitches too. It's not a big deal. Now I have chosen to swing these away with a button press once you've disconnected. You can also use hard points and disconnect automatically once you have noticed that you've hit maximum pressure. Maximum pressure is 999.97 atmospheres, in case you're wondering, not the 90 atmospheres that the tanks technically start at if you just tell them to start full. That's why you have to add more pressure. You've got to punch 9 times more fuel in, or 900% more fuel in, and that is going to always be required even if you do use the metal tanks, so you might as well not use them. These heavy boosters on the side here, they're just standard rocket, solid rocket fuel boosters. And what they do is when they run out of fuel, they just fire off their hardpoint. And that disconnects our side of the hardpoint and makes them fall off. Because they all trigger at the same speed, they trigger at the same moment, they run for the same length of time, they just independently fall off. If this was a liquid fuel system, you'd have to be a little bit more careful to detach both of them at the exact same moment, because liquid fuel sometimes wobbles. It sometimes backs up and doesn't go at the exact same rate. You wouldn't want to leave one of them attached and the other one detaching. That would really screw you up. I also use the seat. The seat trigger is what turns the engines on and off. So when I hit that seat trigger, I am using the seat data. The seat data can be passed through the hardpoint, and then you can take the 31st value, which is actually listed. It's not a secret. You can see it right here on the screen. Trigger 31. So you just take the 31st value for that trigger, and that will let you turn on your rocket with that value. It's basic programming. It's one of those things where you should learn how to do that if you haven't done it before. Otherwise, it can be difficult to communicate across this kind of hardpoint system. You'd have to find another way to hook these tanks up, and the hardpoints are the best in this case. In terms of the fuel tanks, as I said, it's just a bowl, a column, and I've got an air filter right in this tank, and for the other intake it goes up, and then there's an air filter here. It's extremely simple. There's no gotchas, there's no hidden wiring or anything. It's just air filters that go straight into the tanks, and it's so straightforward and so simple. There is nothing complicated about this rocket. The only thing that's even vaguely complicated is I put in a whole bunch of math things that do things like divide the amount of fuel in the tank by the actual capacity of the fuel to check whether you've hit that 999 atmosphere limit. But you don't even have to do that if you don't want to. I did it because I wanted to make sure you could see what was going on, but you don't have to if you don't want to. I added in some solar. This is more than enough solar. You don't have to go overboard with your solar unless you're doing something that requires electricity. When it comes to determining your speed, one thing of note is you could use a linear speed sensor, but those only work in the atmosphere. So most people will use a, what's it called? An astronomy sensor. These astronomy sensors give you a pack of data, and you don't want to screw with it. You do not want to worry about what the astronomy sensor is saying. It's really aggressive nonsense, and it involves multiplying 2 of the axes by 40,000 and 1 of the axes by 419,019. So you normally will just find yourself a nice plugin that will do the math for you and just use values from that. I actually have a micro plugin specifically for speed. which just gets the speed value and is only, 1/2. But that's how I get the speed. You can't really use, linear speedometer for space travel. It won't let you see how fast you're going. Other than that, there's really no surprises here. I don't think there are any things I haven't taught you. Since you're going to be pumping things in, you are probably going to have to make some simple mechanisms to move your various things away from your rocket. Obviously, you're free to design your rocket however you want, but in general, I find that moving things away from the rocket is easier than trying to design a rocket that fits between things. So that's why this slides back. That's why these swing out. The only thing that actually holds you in place at the final countdown are these little legs on the ground here. Those are the last things to detach when you actually fire the rocket up. There's really no complexity here, nothing surprising going on. If you want to take a look at this, it's available in the community workshop, and I invite you to make your own rocket using the same basic principles, and it will be much cooler than mine because mine literally doesn't do anything. It exists solely to get off of the ground and into space. See you around.